Well, Rory, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you with us.
It's a huge pleasure to be on.
Amazing.
I'm hoping to learn as much from you as you do from me, if not more. So this is why I find podcasts particularly rewarding, actually.
Well, I'm very much out there.
Yeah.
I'm very much out there.
Generally, someone who produces a podcast, by dint of having the level of interest necessary to produce the podcast, also has a level of curiosity sufficient to be, to contribute wildly, I think. So I'm very, very excited.
Well, you've sort of created a wonderful segue into my first question, actually, because I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, is that I've been really fortunate to pick lots of brains in my podcast of very respected people, luminaries, you'd say. But I think I don't remember being as excited about picking a brain than picking yours, as incredibly sycophantic as that sounds. Now, where I want to start is your fantastic book, Alchemy. And anyone listening, I recommend stop what you're doing, go on Amazon and buy Alchemy. It is an incredible book, and it completely changed the way I think about things. Now, the central thesis of the book is this idea of the logical brain versus what you call the psychological brain, or ways of thinking. Now, I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about the logical or rational part of the brain, but let's start with this idea of the psychological part of the brain. Why is it so important, and why is it so dormant in most people in the business world?
Well, I suppose the first thing is that the understanding that there are about 2 or 3 understandings, I think, from psychology, which are now more or less fairly widely acknowledged, or at least acknowledged as if phenomena. If not, even if this isn't the perfect description, it's a very useful tool for understanding behaviour. One of which is that many, many decisions are basically taken emotionally and then post-rationalised. But in retrospect, we tend to discount the emotional part of the decision and simply, effectively, reverse engineer our decision as though it had been rational all along. Okay, and a second important part is that our perception in any case is not objective. In that what something is to the human depends on what it feels like, not what it is. So this is why I think the train joke which I made in 2009, was so decisive, which is that an engineer will assume that to improve a train journey, you have to make the train journey faster or more punctual. In other words, they'll have some objective, real-world, SI-derived unit measure for what constitutes quality. And yet, to the human brain, what constitutes quality is a much more complicated thing, which is heavily derived from things which aren't really quantifiable or measurable. So my argument would be, in defining how you improve the Eurostar, the engineer automatically defines the question as an engineering problem which requires an engineering solution and nothing else. Now, the marketer or the salesman or someone interested in psychology would say, no, our job is to get people out of the plane and into the train. And so they might say, how can we make the train journey more appealing? How can we make it more enjoyable? And as a result, I think, the necessary sort of almost bureaucratic urge in the modern world to define every problem in terms that has a reductionist numerical solution fundamentally leads to an extraordinary misdirection of effort, because how long the train journey lasts, by the way, doesn't depend on the duration of the train journey. We all know phrases like time flies when you're having fun, or it was the longest 10 minutes of my life. And time is our perception of time is highly subjective. If we're enjoying ourselves or we're feeling useful, time actually flies by. You might also add the point that if time is of a very high quality, we don't want to reduce the journey anyway. No cruise ship boasts how fast it is, really. Yeah. Because the whole point is that the time spent on board is intrinsically pleasurable and worthwhile in itself. And so the very assumption that you want to reduce journey time may be actually slightly wrong. That you may actually say, well, no, it's very interesting, by the way. One of the reasons now I always turn up early at airports, okay, There used to be a phrase which said that if you've never missed a plane, you've spent too much of your life at airports. In other words, the margin of error you allow for catching a flight has meant you've wasted, 57 hours of your life basically hanging around. And my argument to that is actually the opposite, which is that actually, no, that would have been true in the age before Wi-Fi, in the age before airport lounges, maybe, okay? There would have been a certain logic to that point, okay? But my point now is that if you have 2 hours in an airport lounge before you have to go to the gate, it's actually pretty valuable. That's a unit of time you can use. Whereas actually, if you arrive and you've only got 35 minutes, basically you can't get anything done in that time. So you're better off weirdly arriving early than you are arriving, closer to the point of departure. And so I find the whole thing just very, very interesting, because in some cases what we're trying to do now is possibly the very opposite of what we should be trying to do.
But why is that though? Because it feels to me, and I guess this is the argument in the book, is that maybe the default way of thinking is the psychological part of the brain, but because of the way the world is now constructed, is that it's forced this economic modelling. So
in any institutional setting, I mean, consumers probably admit to some degree that they make their decisions pretty emotionally, and one of the reasons they admit that is they don't have to justify their decisions to anybody else except perhaps their spouse. Okay, and what happens in an institutional setting is that people are more interested in having a decision they can defend or justify than they are in having a decision that leads to beneficial consequences. Because for your own personal career outcome, no one ever got fired for being too rational.
Yeah.
Okay, it's much easier to get fired for being irrational than it is for being unimaginative. Okay? I'm terribly sorry. Everything you've done has been perfectly sensible and logical, but we're just going to have to let you go because your thinking is just fundamentally boring and workmanlike. Okay, it doesn't really happen very much. Least of all, the larger the institution becomes, perhaps the more that kind of conformity prevails, to a point where I think we think that quality of reasoning or rigor in reasoning is a good proxy for quality in decision making. And it's, they're correlated to some extent in that, there are obviously more, there is a large set of totally daft, imaginative, interesting solutions that will lead to catastrophe. And if you simply want to avoid total catastrophe, you might argue that the well-reasoned decision has a certain safety to it. But equally, it won't lead to any breakthrough discoveries either.
Yeah, it's interesting because... Sorry, go on, finish your thought, Rory. Sorry,
I mean, it is... I think it's also something that comes from... At school, we're taught that something that's scientific has a single right answer. And, there's generally the economic idea of the trade-off. It's a trade-off between two things, but the optimal point between, price and quality is here. Okay? Yeah. Now, what markets teach us is actually that in marketing problems, or in therefore human psychological problems, there's more than one right answer, and sometimes the opposite of a good idea is another good idea. We see it all the time in markets that you get, if you like, you get, super luxury airlines and you get low cost airlines. You have the Dyson, you have the Henry. Yeah. Okay. They're both, by the way, kind of cool and interesting in their own very different ways. But I think there's this idea that people are trying to be singly and inarguably right to defend their decision making.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
The hidden price we pay is that the more interesting decisions or the more divergent decisions never get made, and we never discover, therefore, what would work if we actually stop pretending to be rational for a couple of days.
Yeah, and I suppose by definition, you kind of suffocate creativity in that process as well, right? Because if you're constantly looking for a rational answer, then the part of your brain that you're using is not the right part of your brain. It's really interesting you mentioned that before.
Also, the rational brain your rational brain is very similar to everybody else's.
Yeah.
So you'll end up in the same place. And this is one of my great complaints about both business schools and management consultancy, which is if you teach everyone the same way, or if you go through a business sector basically deploying the same playbook in 5 competing companies in the same sector, what you do is you destroy economic value, net.
Yeah.
Because you effectively produce 5 businesses that are engaged in hyper competition, which means there's very little potential for real value creation. Whereas what you want to be doing is going through a sector and saying, how can we make you the opposite of them, but still appealing?
We're seeing that played out in the industry of SaaS at the moment, is that it's basically become so cookie cutter in the way that these organizations are created, and they're all VC funded, so they all go and put the same people into the same organizations. Yep. And there's a buyer backlash because of that as well, is that the buyer's getting pissed off by the way that they're being sold to by these organizations. But on top of what you're saying, and it really ratifies your point, there was a study that was done this year, or actually last year and part of this year, that showed that 53% of buying decisions within organisations were not happening because of basically fear of messing up. That people didn't want to purchase these things because they were worried about the risk of purchasing something. Which
no one ever got fired for buying IBM. I mean,
exactly.
I always say that's one of the most useful things I've done, I think, which is reversing the telescope, which is that all people selling things think people want better.
Yeah.
And actually, the instinctive brain wants less likely to be crap.
Yeah.
And I always use that to explain why McDonald's is the most successful restaurant in the world. There are other factors as well, obviously. I'm not totally discounting supply chain efficiency or whatever.
Marketing.
But the principal reason why you go to McDonald's is not because you believe you're going to have the best meal you've ever had in your life, but you're going to have a meal which, at the worst case scenario, is pretty good.
Yeah.
And it in a sense, if you're in a hurry, if you haven't got time to get out TripAdvisor and get an Uber to the other side of town and so on, that's not a bad decision. I always complain that Heathrow Terminal 5 doesn't have a McDonald's, and my argument is, look, I'm going to be on a plane for 8 hours. My principal concern about this meal is it doesn't make me ill.
Yeah.
And fair enough. If you consider the number of, I know of Michelin-starred restaurants where a significant percentage of people who go there actually have a stomach upset afterwards. Now, I'm not going to name them, but people generally don't. By the way, when they go to a fancy, very good meal, they don't share the fact that I spent 120 quid to get the shits. Okay? And what you have to say about McDonald's, given its billion people served or whatever, is it does an extraordinary job of not making you ill. I mean, if you consider the scale at which it operates. And I think that absence of negatives, and also in B2B decision making, it's more complicated still, because I always say in B2C decision making, you're trying to minimize the risk of regret, and in B2B decision making, you're trying to minimize the risk of blame.
Yeah,
blame is a bit weird, because the modern equivalent of IBM might be one of the big 4 consulting or accounting firms. Okay, if you appoint them, if anything goes wrong, your colleagues will go, isn't that extraordinary that PwC made that terrible mistake? If you appoint a small boutique firm, the blame doesn't go to them. It's your fault for not appointing PwC.
Yeah.
So there's an enormous fundamental trend against making eccentric decisions through fear of cocking up. And I think this has become worse because I remember the 80s and the early 90s. And the early 90s and the 80s were periods of great business over-optimism, if you like, but certainly optimism, where the general tenet in business was go for it.
Mm.
And now, with things like quarterly reporting, the general tenet of business is don't mess up.
Yeah.
If you do mess up, make sure you've got a good reason for why things went wrong. And I noticed that decision-making becomes much braver when you have something like a pandemic, because you actually have an excuse for failure. So the whole business world acted very, very quickly and extremely inventively during the pandemic. And part of the reason was that you suddenly created this kind of atmosphere where, our sales, we've got a perfectly good reason why our restaurant sales are a disaster, which is that we can't open the bloody restaurant. So decisions like let's do home delivery or whatever it may be, or let's experiment with app ordering at the pub, which would have taken 5 years to implement normally, actually happened in a period of months. And the pandemic was a lesson in a way in how fast business can act when it doesn't have the constraint of defensive decision making.
Brilliant. It's really interesting you say that. Really interesting.
I mean, Gerd Gigerenzer, who's the great guru, the author of a book called, among others, Risk Savvy. There's a new... he's at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And when we were chatting, he said if it wasn't for really defensive decision making, which is quite often arse covering disguised as rigour,
Yeah.
And you can do a hell of a lot of arse covering at the company's own expense because it looks like rigour.
Yeah.
Okay. And he said that, basically without defensive decision making, we could have the same economy and all go home on Wednesday afternoon. I mean, it is an extraordinary taxation on institutional action. The other thing, by the way, which I mustn't forget, because it's a recent observation of mine, is that one of the other facets that arises because we post-rationalise our emotional decisions is that successful marketing becomes invisible, because we only notice marketing when it fails to persuade us. When marketing works, or when sales works, we do not say, I was sold a so-and-so, or I was, thanks to the brilliant marketing, I was persuaded to do X. Now, when marketing or sales works, what do we say to ourselves and to everybody else? I decided to do this.
Yeah, really interesting.
And so the second you've got to... There's a wonderful poem by a guy called John Harrington, I think it is, who's an Elizabethan poet. He was the inventor of the flush toilet. He's also the direct ancestor of Kit Harington, who plays Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. Fascinating. But his poem was, treason never doth prosper, here's the reason, for if it prospers, none dare call it treason. No. And his point is that you never get a successful piece of treason, because when it does succeed, it's called a revolution. I joke about this to Americans, that actually, the American War of Independence wasn't much any less treasonous really than the attack on the Capitol in January, whatever it was, okay? The difference was that one succeeded, whereas the other one failed, okay? And in the same way, you get this asymmetry of perception where you have something in sales and marketing where whenever it's successful, it becomes 80% less visible. Because the human brain does not want to go around saying, I bought the iPhone because Steve Jobs did such a great presentation. Marketers might say that, just about. But they don't go, Steve was such a great marketer, he persuaded me to buy the iPhone. They go, I decided to buy the iPhone. And a well-marketed product is not perceived as a well-marketed product. It's perceived as a great product. Okay? And there are great products which we've failed to market, and they just sit there for years.
It reminds me of that wonderful David Ogilvy quote in the book, actually, which was, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was, people don't. You'll know it better than I. It was people. I can't remember exactly what it was. People don't feel what they say, or they don't.
I remember it. Yes, it's I think funny enough, he never said it, but it's always attributed to him. We can't find any reference to him saying it, but it's a great quote anyway.
Yeah.
And it was something like, the trouble with market research is that people don't think what they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's so true as well.
And by the way, that defensive decision-making thing, once you understand it, it massively elevates the importance of sales and marketing in the economy, because you realise that the natural default position of most institutional decision makers, entrepreneurs are slightly different, okay? Independent family-owned companies are slightly different because they're independent actors whose interests are fairly well aligned. In other words, the interests of the family who own a company are fairly well aligned to the interests of the company as a whole.
Yeah.
So entrepreneurs and privately owned businesses are slightly different in this respect. But you realise that in any business other than that, the instinct basically to do what everybody else does or to do what I've done last time is such a strong default that actually getting people to change their behaviour or to do something differently requires some fairly significant input of resources to overcome defensive decision making.
And the way you position things needs to be different as well, right? I mean, what it actually comes down to, and I guess this is what I've wrestled with since I've read the book, is that, and it's not directly referenced in the book, but it really made me think about this. What is value? That's the question that I kept thinking, because when you're purchasing something, there's an assumption of the value of what you're purchasing, but actually the value can be slightly more ethereal or intangible, and in some ways quite milky.
It's funny you say this, because this sort of various, with the possible exception of the Austrian school of economics, who accept the fact that value is purely subjective, and therefore they accept that marketing and sales, I'm bracketing them together for this purpose, are as much part of the value creation process as manufacturing is. Everybody else basically had a problem with this, because once you acknowledge that value is ethereal, neoliberal economics got around it by just pretending that people know to the penny what something is worth and how much utility they'll derive from it. Trust is also murky and ethereal.
Yeah.
So what they've simply done is, in neoliberal economics, they've simply removed trust and subjective factors from the equation, and said that that everybody knows exactly how much value they'll derive from something. Now, it's obviously nonsense. They also assume that every transaction takes place under conditions of perfect trust, which is obvious nonsense, okay? I mean, there's a level of uncertainty involved in every decision you take. And as a result, what they've done is they've effectively repositioned marketing and sales as a kind of cost or an inefficiency, not as an integral part of the whole. Roe Alderson said something in 1959 when he said, what we don't need is an economic view of the value added by marketing. We need a marketing view of the whole process of creating utility.
Right, okay.
And the Austrians probably got this right. The Austrians would be the most ad and sales friendly of any economic school. Marx also acknowledged that he understood there was use value, there was exchange value. I would argue that the problem with housing is that its investment value dwarfs its use value, or has done for the last 25 years.
Yeah.
And therefore, what is the real value of a house? Was a question that didn't get asked. In other words, people basically went and they asked the question, how much can I strip together as a deposit? How much can me and my partner borrow together? I'll add the maximum borrowing amount to my maximum deposit, and I'm going to look for houses at that price, because houses go up in value, so the bigger the bet you make, the more you gain. And as a result, houses became stupidly expensive. Now, nobody buys cars that way, right? Because they go, well, I'd love an Aston Martin, whatever it is, but to be honest, the amount of driving I do and the amount of money I have and my need to spend money on holidays and food and other entertainments, means that it's much more sensible for me to compromise with a hot hatch, right? Okay, than going full in on the Aston Martin. But interestingly, because of, and so every single economist has kind of wrestled with this in a sense, because once you acknowledge that psychology matters, economics becomes a fundamentally different discipline in many ways.
Yeah.
Adam Smith, by the way, never denied any of this. I mean, Adam Smith was basically a social, he was a philosopher, actually, I suppose. But I mean, Adam Smith never denied in either of his books that that people's motivations were highly emotional. He writes very interestingly about luxury goods, for example. Why is it that people will pay an extra 10 guineas for a watch that is more accurate to within 5 seconds, a day, when ostensibly the whole purpose of watch is to keep you punctual, and it's not as if people with expensive watches are notably more punctual than anybody else, nor indeed would anybody else notice to within that level of kind of exactitude. And he spots the fact that there are kind of Veblen goods, there are there are status goods, there are goods which we principally buy for what they say about us, and where the principal value resides in what they mean, not what they are.
Yeah, well,
what they mean, not what they do. For example, I mean, champagne is an extraordinary case of that, which is that the guys who make British sparkling wine, people like Chapeldown, they only really cracked the code when they basically tripled the price.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? It's so interesting because if you read any of Hilke Plasman or Baba Shiv, the work that they've done on price in the brain, it's so fascinating because not only are people drawn towards higher prices, the reward system in the brain fires like if you were to take cocaine or see a beautiful woman or a beautiful man. And on top of that, when you use the higher price product, you feel like you're extracting more value out of it, and it improves your performance, your perceived performance. So it's really interesting.
There's a beautiful observation by someone where it said that the perfect price for something is where it hurts a bit. That to make something enjoyable as a luxury good, the price you charge has to actually have has to have an element of kind of ooh to it.
Yeah.
And it is really, really fascinating because there's something in a weird kind of way, I mean, that's one of of course, the central criticisms of the central tenet of economics, which is there are so many cases where it appears people deep down want to spend more for some reason. And of course, I mean, it's by the way, it's quite important in terms of, and price is fascinating because it receives far less attention than it deserves. There are whole loads of areas of marketing. Partnerships is another one, by the way. I mean, there is a company within WPP which I absolutely adore, which is almost unique in that their whole raison d'etre is the establishment of brand partnerships. Things like Orange Wednesdays, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I think those are absolutely brilliant because they actually are economics at its purest, which is the two participating partners and the consumer can all benefit without money changing hands. Their symbiosis. That's an area which I think simply because nobody knew how to. The problem with marketing services is that the size of any particular part of marketing services and therefore the attention paid towards it tends to be proportionate to what extent people found they could make money from it. And people can make a lot of money from bought media advertising in the age of media commission. So a huge number of agencies sprang up to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas equally important parts of marketing, like pricing, for example, receive a tiny, tiny fraction of the attention they deserve.
It's really interesting. It's really, really interesting. I guess just to go back to the book for a second, do you know what my biggest fear with the book was?
Mm-hmm.
It was you're the anomaly and the rest of us are the problem. And actually, the way you think about the world is the right way. And I think partially because of your career and partially because of your profession, you've become particularly adept at not only thinking that way, but also being self-conscious enough to know you're thinking that way. And my worry was that actually the type of thinking you were talking about can't be modelled. That was my biggest fear about the book.
It can't be... Oh, crikey. It can't be modelled in the sense that Newtonian physics is modelled. I think, on the other hand, there's pattern recognition. I think what you do with a complex system is you look for recurring patterns. And that may be the best you can do. It's like meteorology, okay? That's really a kind of... Computers have been very, very useful in meteorology. Interestingly, what they use the computers to do is effectively data visualization. And it's humans who decide what's going to happen.
Right.
And what's kind of interesting about that, to an extent, is that I think there is room for progress, and so what I would say is there aren't rules, but there are checklists. That you need. And the other thing I think that's important is that I don't necessarily say my way of looking at life is right or the only way. There are lots of cases, by the way, where economics isn't a bad approximation of reality. Actually, there aren't that many. Okay.
Couldn't help yourself.
Okay. But it's absolutely vital that you look at the world in more than one way.
Yeah.
And a lot of science has been about, in the physical sciences, about we can narrow down the ways of looking at the world to this one correct way. And it is possible to effectively embody that in a mathematical formula or something of that kind. I think that's a false god in anything involving complex emergent systems. I just think there's a great quote which I'll try and find from an Israeli economist. Let me see if I can actually find it in my. I'll look for it here, where he said that you have economics. It's almost, if I'd known it when I wrote the book Alchemy, I would have put this at the absolute opening pages, which is that economics, if it wants to capture reality, has to move away from a model where effectively amazing things, surprising, extraordinary things can't happen. And let me just here we go. I'll try and find it. But it's patently clear that human behaviour is non-linear. It's not proportionate. It's also the other great lie that economics tells in order to try and make itself mathematically tractable is to suggest that we're not influenced by the behaviour of others, that every decision is like a standalone watertight unit.
Yeah.
Now, I've often said to smaller companies, actually the reason you advertise is A, because nobody's heard of you. And we forget that. It's really boring, right? Okay? Because we're always talking about brand and purpose and things like that. But actually, if nobody's heard of you, two things. Sales often underappreciates marketing. I mentioned the fact that marketing and sales are underappreciated because when they work, we attribute their success to something else. I decided to. Seduction is the same. You don't get people going, he persuaded me to sleep with him. Okay. We go, I decided to. Okay. And so we always rewrite history with hindsight as though our own agency and our own decision making was the sole arbiter of action. Okay. But also it's worth noting that marketing is probably undervalued by sales because a very large part of the value of marketing resides in what the salesman doesn't have to do.
Yeah.
And I always remember a guy who went from selling a car with a pretty bad reputation to selling a car with a really good reputation. I can't remember the exact details. It was a bit like going from selling kind of Alfa Romeos or something, just great cars, by the way, and very unfairly maligned, I suspect, but selling Audis or something. And the whole point was there were 150 points of reassurance that you didn't have to engage the customer in them because they already believed them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's worth noting that sales doesn't necessarily recognise the value of marketing because they just think they're being a better salesman, when in reality they're a better salesman because of all the questions they don't have to answer anymore. And one of those is, who the hell are you? I've never heard of you, is not a great starting point for a salesperson.
Yeah, agree. I mean, but often...
Whereas going into someone and saying, you've probably heard a hell of a lot of noise about blah, let me tell you why people are getting so excited by it, okay? Yeah. That's probably, pretty good starting spiel,
Well,
brilliantly, Ogilvy, back in the day, my God, it was in my childhood, Krona Margarine, they had to launch a margarine. No one had fucking heard of it, okay, right? Krona Margarine launched in the UK. And they didn't launch it from scratch, going, there's this margarine you've never heard of, right? They said, I assume this was truthful, I'm hoping it was, they just said, this is the best-selling margarine in Australia. Questions have been asked in Parliament about it. Da, 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 da. When it launched in Australia, it created a sensation. And now you're going, flaming hell is it these Australians are going so mad about this bloody margarine? I went, and then, when I went shopping with my mum, I insisted she bought the Corona margarine because I wanted to see what all the noise was about. And
it's interesting.
So that was a brilliant case of taking a product that nobody had ever heard of and effectively saying, this is a really famous product. The reason you've never heard of it is it's not famous here yet.
Yeah, it's so true, and I guess this is being borne out in the modern buyer journey in B2B, which is the salesperson is getting involved in the purchase much later on than they ever were. And on top of that, their role is becoming less significant than it used to be. And I think this is because of content marketing and obviously the birth of the internet, is that the buyer is a lot more informed and have access to more information. And marketing obviously has a big part to play in that. So there's no doubt.
I think we've got to be really careful about this, because I think the whole shift to digital has been driven by the idea that the buyer has more information and they can find out what they need to know. But actually, you don't search for things you've never heard of at a very banal level. I mean, one of the things that worries me about advertising, digital advertising, my wife told me this about a week ago, which is when she was a kid, she used to travel to school from Haywards Heath Station. And every single day of the year, there was one poster opposite the tracks on Haywards Heath Station, which told you what was on at the Royal Festival Hall in the forthcoming 6 to 8 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I go month to month, without thinking about them. She said that every single concert they went to at the Royal Festival Hall was basically a result of this poster. Because I go from 1 month to the next without thinking about the existence of the Royal Festival Hall. Probably when she said poster for the Royal Festival Hall, that was the first time Royal Festival Hall had entered my consciousness in 4 years. Okay, and I don't actually go and look to see what's on.
Mm.
And so no one's going to win a creative award for saying here's what's on the Royal Festival Hall. But in terms of people going to the Royal Festival Hall, something as seemingly banal as that provision of push information.
Of course, but what you...
By the way, I've got the quote for you.
Oh yeah, please.
Israel Kurtzner, who's a British-born economist, and the quote is, "An economics which seeks to grapple with the real-world circumstance of open-endedness must transcend an analytical framework which cannot accommodate genuine surprise."
Well, you'd argue by definition it can't exist then.
Yeah, no. No, I think the analytical framework has to acknowledge complexity and has to acknowledge to some extent uncertainty, because we have to acknowledge we're in a world with butterfly effects.
This is my point, though.
Where effects too small to measure can have
But this is actually almost a great analogy for the markets themselves, though, right? Is that I'd argue that a farmer in Texas can have as much effect on the market and the stock market particularly by behaviour than a particular company doing something or not doing something, because all it is it's actually a macrocosm of human behaviour. That's all it is. I don't think you can analyse it in any rational way. I really don't.
Well,
and that's why
I'll tell you a lovely story about the sales of the book, which is kind of interesting. Which is that I appeared on Chris Evans' breakfast show when he was in Cannes, and he interviewed me about the book. And lovely guy, actually, all credit to him. He obviously read the book before he interviewed me, but had to skim read it because he'd only heard of the book a few hours before. And then he spent the afternoon apparently on the beach reading the book, and he liked the book. And so the following day, unbeknownst to me, Chris Evans spent about half the next day breakfast show generally quoting from the book and generally being highly enthusiastic about it. I didn't know this was happening. I was just wandering around in the south of France, and suddenly on Amazon, I was outselling. It lasted for about a week. I was outselling J.K. Rowling. It lasted for about a week, but this utterly freakish. Now that happened. I never would have thought, hey, I need to sell this book. Let's get on the Chris Evans breakfast show. it happened because one of his researchers had happened to pick up the book at random and say, Chris, I think you'll really like this. That's why it happened. It didn't happen because of any intent. And I think this extent that we're trying to make marketing deterministic, where the fundamental role of marketing is to be probabilistic. It's to improve your odds of success, not to improve your odds of being lucky in some as yet to be undefined way. Okay?
Yeah, really good way of putting it.
Okay, so what Nassim Taleb would probably say is to increase your surface area exposure to positive upside opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's very simple. If you're famous, right, more lucky shit happens to you than if you're not famous. Simply because, the number of, people come to you with shit, okay?
Yeah.
People you've never heard of come and say, I've got this thing you might find interesting. Why did you come to me? Because you've heard of me. Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Now, the obscure companies aren't getting that. If you're Rolls-Royce, I always say this, if you're Rolls-Royce aero engines, right, there's a huge value to your brand which never gets quantified, which is, bluntly put, when your chief executive rings somebody up, they fucking won't call back, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, possibly not true of, say, Joe Biden, but broadly speaking, practically anybody on the planet would return a phone call from the chief executive of Rolls-Royce aero engines or something like that, or Lockheed Martin or whatever it might be. And the value of that is extraordinary, but no one attempts to quantify it. And so quantifying the value of a brand, first of all, in advance, is a bit of a fool's errand, because some of the value of fame is going to arrive in areas you never anticipated, and therefore in areas that you will fail to quantify.
Yeah.
So merely saying, we are doing X to achieve Y, the only value of X will be determined by the extent to which it achieves Y, and all other value derived from activity X will be discounted, will automatically mean, I think, you discount the value of publicity and advertising. Because it will always, by its very nature, particularly mass media advertising, will always deliver maybe 2/3 of its value. Now, notionally, the value of consumer advertising, officially, is that consumers go, oh, I never knew, I must go and buy some of that when I go to Sainsbury's, right? And, by the way, I think some part of it probably works that way. But a very large part of the value of mass advertising is the buyer at Sainsbury's goes, shit, they're advertising that thing. Punters will be coming in wanting to buy it, so I better put some on the shelves. So Sainsbury's put it on the bloody shelf, and a lot of people who haven't even seen the advertising go in and go, ooh, what's that? Right? Okay. Or there's a lot of this on the shelf, so it must be good. And this attempt to say, I will determine how I'm going to succeed in a very narrowly defined way. And the only success I can actually lay claim to is the success that I predicted in advance.
Yeah.
Fundamentally reduces people's capacity to do things which are what you might call speculative. Which is, if I become more famous, good things will happen, I'm not sure what.
Yeah. Well, it's like saying, it's like judging Van Gogh by the amount of paintings he sold in his lifetime versus the actual paintings that are now. It's like
one, I think, wasn't it? I think he sold one painting, if I'm right, in his lifetime.
I think he did, and I think actually Theo Van Gogh, his brother, was obviously an art dealer, and I think he might have greased the wheels for that deal to get one of his brother's paintings over the line, to be honest with you. So
Theo could have done a better job of it, couldn't he? I mean, if he's an art dealer and presumably knows how to market art, you have to say.
But we also need to thank him, because he did basically pay for Van Gogh's whole art career, and I think he even paid for him to come to London and to come to Paris as well. So
he fell in love with his landlady's daughter or something, didn't he, in London?
There
was some sort of romance. I'm trying to remember what it was. Yeah,
I think he was an art teacher in Battersea, I think, which not a lot of people remember. He still isn't famed for it anyway.
My grandmother went to a school called, I think it was called Alice Otley School in Worcester in about 1910, I think. No, it would have been about something like that. But she missed by 2 years having Edward Elgar as her violin teacher. Which would have been pretty cool. Yeah.
it's a good claim to fame, I suppose. It's a good claim to
I've got a
fame.
vague idea. I've got a vague idea that P.G. Wodehouse had T.S. Eliot as a French teacher at Dulwich College. Or
Is
something.
that right?
But you get these extraordinary things, don't you? There's also the one which is that I think Wittgenstein was at school with Hitler, and Paul Dirac was at school with Cary Grant. Yeah.
Is that right? Do you know
Both
what?
Bristol. Paul Dirac was Bristolian. Yeah.
My it's quite funny you say that. My brother was taught by Nick Hornby, who was a supply teacher in his school, and my brother's name is Mark Godfrey, and the name Mark Godfrey appears in one of his books.
Oh wow!
But I'm not sure that my brother had that much of an effect on him that he chose the name, but I think it's just pure chance. But my brother doesn't believe that. He tells it at dinner party.
No. It probably isn't complete chance. No, there's a whole thing about Eleanor Rigby, because there is a grave which McCartney claimed he came up with the Eleanor Rigby thing just out of nowhere, but then there's this grave to someone in a graveyard in Liverpool to Eleanor Rigby, which McCartney would have walked past a lot.
Right.
So there's a whole piece about this, which is McCartney's remarkable facility for memory, and actually in that case, I think he'd remembered something he didn't remember remembering. If you see what I mean.
Osmotically took it on without actually realising it. Interesting. I guess I got one final question. Rick,
So why are you called Evans if your brother's called Godfrey?
We've got different fathers.
Ah, got it. Okay.
But I don't like to call him my half brother. He's older than me, so since the minute I was born, he's been there. So he's always my brother. Me and my brothers have got a sort of strange unwritten code where we don't call each other half brothers out of respect for each other. but
No. Nor should you. No, I completely agree.
No.
Evans, is your dad Welsh or?
No, he wasn't Welsh. He's English all the way through. But I think there's a bit of a misconception because I think Evans is like the 12th most common surname in England. I don't think it's necessarily a Welsh name, but I know obviously you were born in Wales, weren't you? You're a Welsh.
No. Well, Davis is a weird one because the traditional thing is that Davis is the English spelling and IES tends to be Welsh. Although weirdly, it's completely reversed in the United States, where for some reason the people who wrote down their papers. Davis in the US, so Jefferson Davis was actually of Welsh descent, for example.
Right. Okay.
And so you have this slightly odd thing, which is IS in the United States probably means you're Welsh, ironically,
Right.
whereas in the UK I think it probably means you're English.
It's probably a lot of self-loathing British and Welsh people when they filled out the papaperwork didn't want to admit where they were from.
They went and swapped. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
I now identify as Welsh or whatever. Yeah.
I don't think anyone's ever done that, but but maybe the case. Maybe the case. Yeah, I got one last question for you, and it's one that's it's quite a divisive one actually. Well, I don't know whether it is divisive or not, but it's something that I've thought about for a long, long time. In any organisation I've worked in, there's a invisible silo between, and sometimes visible silo between sales and marketing, and almost a sort of bad blood between the two departments. I've worked in some businesses where they're actually almost an extension of each other's department. But why do you think it is, and what's the remedy for getting the sales organisation and the marketing organisation pulling in the right direction and not trying to take claim for each other's hard work?
Well, I think there is a problem. There's an interesting problem I always wonder about in sales, which is, do most successful salesmen have about 8 secret tricks that they know that will be of inordinate value to the rest of the organisation? Okay, but they keep it to themselves. Because as a salesman, your principal motivation might be to outperform other salesmen rather than to actually increase the sales of the organisation as a whole. So I often wonder about the knowledge that is deliberately kept secret and personal in any sales organisation.
I think I know the answer to that though, Rory.
Go on.
I actually think it's two things. I think they're unconscious competence. And I also think part of the problem is that these salespeople who perform by doing things differently are often perceived to be rogues or lone wolves. And the organisation is constantly trying to bring them in line with how the organisation wants to operate. When in actuality, they should be listening to them and the competencies and basically backwards engineer those competencies into the rest of the sales organisation. They end up stymieing them, to be honest with you.
because I always wonder about what's the difference between a brilliant experience with a telephone sales rep and a an indifferent one, and it probably comes down to some pretty what you might call I mean a lot of the skill is tacit. Maybe some of it can't be taught. It's like tone of voice stuff, I think some of the genius in sales is going to be tacit, but there must be little elements of of craftiness. I always remember a brilliant one, which was a very, very successful car salesman in the United States was asked what was the secret of his success, and he said, because I'm not selling them this car, I'm actually, in my mind, I'm selling them the next one.
Interesting.
The mindset I have is the mindset of someone who wants them to come back and buy another car from me in 3 years' time.
But that's so your book, though, right? And this is what's so interesting about it, is that when you asked me, when you said that thing about the salespeople and it being tacit, what a lot of the great salespeople do is they sell psychologically versus logically, and there's been a huge overcorrection of that in sales over the last 20 years, in my experience, where we're desperate to keep appealing to the logical part of customers' brains, and it's these ROI calculators and stuff that they just do not give a shit about. Where actually, it's what you just described there is what makes great salespeople, but more importantly, makes the buyer happy, which is what we should care about.
But I've never understood the marketing and sales divide, because the two have so much to benefit from each other, because to a point where in moments of supreme success, they're probably the same thing. The other thing, you may remember that episode of Peep Show where Mark has to present at the Kettering conference.
Yeah, bringing sales and marketing together.
Bringing sales and marketing together, okay. And actually, the Scouser's idea, I can never remember what his name is.
Jeff.
But Jeff's actually rather a brilliant. I don't know. Of course, the person who created Peep Show is also the person who created Succession.
Exactly right.
The same scriptwriter.
Yeah.
I've always, to some extent, thought of them as a kind of utter genius because of their, both utter genius at the micro level, which is, it's like putting so-and-so in charge of the LIBOR rate, those little throwaway little lines. But also, Jeff as a character is actually one of those people who is kind of an idiot, but as an instinctive business person, okay, he just knows how to do it instinctively. Yeah. And his suggestion, which Mark, of course, completely discounts until it's too late, okay, because you remember, he said, I couldn't just have that idea again, could you? And he says, oh, yes, I've got it right here. Reaches into his briefcase and then just brings out a finger. Right? And his idea is actually, you need to actually combine sales, marketing, and planning. Now, planning should really be called strategy, because planning and strategy are not the same thing. Okay? But his idea is probably a sensible thing, which is that, in other words, marketing and sales are future focused. Planning isn't really future focused. Planning is, well, it is to a degree, but it's largely extrapolation from the past. The imaginative role of strategy is where you go, what is the future we are hoping to create, essentially, which accepts the fact that the world is, that actually how you sell depends, affects what you sell, that they're sufficient interdependencies that they really should be considered a common skill. They should certainly share information in amongst themselves a lot. I mean, who's going to notice, for example, that you have a freak success in your hands? Okay, well, I'll tell you the perfect example of that. Okay, Ray Kroc at McDonald's, right? The single reason he ended up doing what he was doing is he was selling thick shake machines. And there was a San Bernardino restaurant, which was a very early McDonald's, which had placed an order for 16, right? Which was an insane number, right? And Ray Kroc's basic thing was, a lot of people would have gone, hey, bingo, here you're 16. He actually went along because he wanted to find out what the hell they were doing. And realised, okay, this is something. So you are the front line. The front line gets information about change first.
Yeah.
It's what I always say about big data. We shouldn't be looking for regularities and averages and aggregates. We should be looking for anomalies. And it's why, in a sense, I get very cross when people go, it's anecdotal.
Yeah.
All really information emerges first as an anecdote or a seemingly trivial observation. I mean, okay, before you have data on, the fact that your enemy is massing on your northern border, the earliest point at which that information will become available to you is that someone in so-and-so has noticed a lot of traffic in the night.
Yeah.
Okay? So anecdotes are your early warning system in many ways. And they're not always reliable. You don't bet the farm on them, but you pay disproportionate attention to things which that anecdote might actually foretell or portend.
It's really interesting. Really interesting.
So I get very crazy. Oh, well, it's anecdotal. Yeah, but well, hold on a second. Anecdotal means you can't bet the farm on it this yet, but it does tell you where you need to investigate further.
It's a signal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, Rory, I've really loved talking to you, and it didn't disappoint. It's been so much fun, and to be honest with you, I could sit here for another 10 hours and talk to you, and probably learn a whole lot more as well. For the audience listening or watching, where's the best place to get hold of you? Where's the best place to see your amazing work?
Well, Twitter is the best, at Rory Sutherland, all one word. I'm writing another book. I'm in the process of writing another book, which might be about slogans, which is what 100 or 70 or 50, depending on how energetic I feel and how much my publisher can send, of the best advertising slogans tell us about ourselves.
Interesting.
Things like L'Oreal's "Because I'm Worth It," for instance, that quite a lot of great advertising slogans have a kind of behavioural science component to them that's really, really interesting.
Well, they all make you say it for yourself, and they're all often commands as well, which I find very interesting. I love Nike's "Just Do It." I mean,
Just do it.
It's genius because it's making you say it, which I love. And McDonald's is even more interesting, where it's making you say, I'm loving it, just by reading their logo. It's talking from your perspective, which is really interesting.
One of the ones I love the most is Cuprinol Quick Drying Wood Stain, which was advertised by Howell Henry. They had a client who insisted on most of the time spent advertising showing the product in use, which was a massive constraint on what they could do creatively. And they ended up with this line, it does exactly what it says on the tin. Okay. And the night before it went out, Steve Henry and a couple of colleagues were basically in the office the evening it went out, basically going, okay, this is it, guys, we're finished, our careers are over. We're going to be the object of ridicule everywhere we go. And then, basically, 6 months later, it had entered the English language to a point that when Cuprinol tried to actually register the phrase, they were told by a barrister, don't be ridiculous, you can't possibly register a phrase which has been in common English parlance for years.
That's amazing. Yeah,
but that was, I think there's something really beautiful about that. And actually, it does exactly what it says on the tin, is what you might call counter-signalling. It just says we don't need to big it up because it is what it is.
Yeah. Really. I remember seeing that for the first time as a child, and it really sticking with me as well, because it's actually very, very clever. It needs no explanation. Yeah, very cool.
It's one of those things. It's one of those things, exactly like the phrase "it is what it is." Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinarily kind of meaningful phrase, even though, of course, grammatically and syntactically, it means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and a real reductionist view of the world as well.
It is what it is. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Rory, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.